thank you to Urban Growth and to David and his team for inviting me to speak today. So throughout this summit, we'll hear of a compelling case for investing in our cities and why Sydney needs more and better infrastructure. The other side of the story, of course, is that providing this investment presents a significant challenge for governments, which leads to an urban renewal and infrastructure pipeline that is slow-moving and an infrastructure deficit that is getting bigger. Today, I'd like to talk about how we might seek to address this challenge. While people have grown accustomed to the traditional infrastructure delivery model, in other sectors, a better understanding of the way that infrastructure creates value is transforming the way services are delivered. And utilities and telco are markets that are in that category. So we can build on this approach by aligning the funding of projects with the value they create and the services they provide. Embedding alternative approaches has the potential to assist in addressing this infrastructure challenge. Firstly, by introducing revenue streams that can enable more projects to be fully funded and delivered earlier. Secondly, by improving projects by creating a stronger connection between project design and the people that benefit from it. And thirdly, by delivering infrastructure based on a funding model that is fairer and more efficient. So in terms of my agenda today, I thought I'd start with painting a picture of the state of the infrastructure market in Australia, and then walk through the concept of alternative funding models, types of value creation, and where alternative models have contributed to successful project delivery, and then concluding with some barriers and challenges and opportunities. So firstly, let me paint a picture of the market as I see it today. What is most exciting is that for once in possibly a generation, we have governments speaking the same or similar language as an infrastructure space. All of this at a time when international infrastructure markets, particularly Europe, are subdued, have less robust financing markets and lack government certainty. The UK PPP market alone has halved in size in the last 6 or 7 years. This slide here just gives you some colour around this. So this is just the PPP transactions that are forecast to close. So in the last 12 months or in the lead up to the end of this year, we'll see over $10 billion of financing closed for infrastructure transactions in Australia. We've also seen infrastructure-related asset sales continue to progress, and David's touched on this in his speech before I spoke. There's also a very active secondary market. For example, in Queensland, a consortium led by Transurban and Sovereign Wealth Fund ADIA purchased a portfolio of toll roads from QIC for over $7 billion. So these examples I've just skipped through add up to over $30 billion of private sector financing being raised just in the past year or so. And we've forecast that future asset sales could lead to around $90 billion of additional investment opportunities. And this is significant in global terms. We also have a very sophisticated domestic superannuation market, and David has also touched on this. And the surveys we've conducted tell us that there are not enough investment opportunities to satisfy their investment appetite. And they've specifically raised the investigation of alternative funding streams as a way of delivering the pipeline. So moving to alternative funding models, the concept. In simple terms, when new or improved infrastructure is delivered by governments, many different groups will benefit. Recognising this spread of value creation can lead to a fairer funding model for infrastructure. This is done by developing revenue streams that are demonstrably connected with the different forms of benefit created, and I'll explore these later. Value-based funding mechanisms and associated financing strategies can enable governments to leverage future revenue streams derived from the uplift in value and economic activity, which occur as a direct result of infrastructure investment, and apply these revenues to project delivery. This model presents an opportunity to share responsibility for project funding equitably amongst those who stand to benefit the most. Take the example of a linear transport project. Journey times to work, education and leisure can become shorter and more reliable, and freight can get between A and B more efficiently. That much should be a given. And the creation of value for these users is being increasingly recognised in funding models that involve the application of direct user charges such as tolls and fare revenue. But although they are clearly the most direct beneficiaries, not all of the value goes to users. much of the benefits are spread through local areas and wider regional catchments. Improvements in transport connectivity can have a profound impact on surrounding land uses, changing a location's residential and commercial potential. While the improved accessibility and mobility will benefit existing residents and businesses, it will also attract others to relocate to the area, which translates into higher commercial and residential land prices and a windfall for existing local property owners. But it's not as simple as identifying forms of value creation and applying them to project budgets. Indeed, this topic provides a good illustration of the differences between funding and financing, which Kelly is going to talk about, and the importance of considering both. In all likelihood, value creation from investments in our cities will not materialise until the assets are operational. In other words, the funds will not materialise until after the bulk of the investment obligation, being the upfront requirement for construction works, has been discharged. In this context, financing has a key role to play in leveraging alternative forms of funds to raise capital on day one. Financing brings the benefit of future funding forward to support spending obligations. At the same time, as this diagram attempts to illustrate, not all the future value creation should be surrendered by beneficiaries in the form of funding contributions. We need to leave some on the table. Otherwise, we have defeated the object of the investment in the first place. Getting this quantum right is very challenging. Transitioning to a beneficiary pays model for infrastructure delivery has the potential to transform the approach to project design and development. This is because the opportunity to leverage alternative funding sources can open up projects to modifications that improve their scope, technical design, and overall value proposition. For example, under conventional project development processes, a new asset may be designed so that it solves a narrow and specific transport problem, such as congestion on a specific stretch of road. Taking a broader view of the impact of the project can introduce options for project packaging to solve other problems and create additional value for other beneficiary groups, such as expanding the scope to include the release of government-owned land or the development of adjacent public amenity improvements. While a revised project scope may result in a project with a higher cost or a more challenging implementation pathway, a fairer funding model with a balanced contribution from all beneficiaries could also decrease the net contribution from conventional government funding sources. So just moving quickly to types of value creation. This slide expands on the earlier slide by showing the type of value received by each beneficiary group. Thinking about it this way is an important part of a bottom-up value assessment, whereby we start not with the source of revenue, but with the project, then the beneficiary, then the benefit, and only the way in which we might use these benefits to develop quantifiable funding streams. Crucially, if it is to be used to fund projects, the different forms of value created need to be demonstrable and attributable, and this is not as easy as it sounds. I'm not an economist, but there are plenty of tools and guidance in place to facilitate the identification of direct and wider benefits of infrastructure investments. Traffic and transport models, for example, generally have the functionality to isolate the impact of given infrastructure investment. So the top diagram is some modelling for the East West Link project in Melbourne, which shows how large projects such as new motorways and rail links provide benefits to users from very wide catchment areas. In other areas, however, the tools are less developed. For example, in assessing the impact on property values and land uses. Where it has been attempted, the results are very interesting. Analysis of land values in the catchment of the M1 in Brisbane, Eastlink in Melbourne, and the M7 in Sydney suggests that there has been an annual growth rate premium of 2 to 6% over land in surrounding areas, and that land value uplifts that occurred from where the routes were identified to the start of operations was between 21 to 49%. In the case of the M1 motorway in Brisbane, average annual growth in industrial land values during the planning, construction and delivery of the Gateway Uproad project between 2003 and 2010 was 22% compared to the industrial market average of 16%. The further development and adaptation of these tools will facilitate clear and objective benefit mapping as the first phase of a beneficiary pays funding strategy. Having identified groups of beneficiary and the nature and incidence of the benefit accruing to them, The next step is to develop mechanisms that can monetise the value and enable it to contribute to project delivery. Many value-based funding mechanisms are technically currently available to Australian governments to leverage the different forms of value created by infrastructure projects, but their use as contributors to project funding has generally been sporadic or poorly executed. In other cases, tools don't exist and new mechanisms may be needed. The funding mechanisms on the screen have been grouped according to the beneficiaries of a transport project. I won't go into detail on these as there's nothing particularly new here, but it is important to point out that firstly, user charges are included, as users are a subset of a beneficiary. And secondly, the list goes well beyond land-based charges, which are often the only ones considered by project planners. So it's tempting to get carried away at this stage. These alternative funding streams are not a licence to charge people at will and must be subject to careful consideration and detailed assessment. In my view, there are a few core principles that should be applied to the exercise of quantifying alternative revenue streams. Firstly, funding should only be contributed by those who benefit. It sounds obvious, but it's an important question. For example, drawing boundaries around the areas of application of any new charges. This is where the modelling and other tools come in. Secondly, funding contributions from any group should, to the greatest extent possible, account for a level of value that's commensurate with the value created. In other words, it should be proportionate and leave a net benefit for beneficiaries. The funding to be provided by any group should be affordable and cognizant of their capacity to pay. It should be able to be implemented in a cost-effective manner. All mechanisms implemented need to be transparent and understandable to the community. And finally, they should be able to support the raising of finance. And this means maximum certainty and minimum volatility. This slide demonstrates how we might sort through the quantification exercise to arrive at a possible package of alternative funding mechanisms for a project. The yellow bars show the size of the potential contributions of different funding mechanisms identified and modelled. We're not going to just pick the biggest ones. They might be the ones that are the hardest to implement or the riskiest for other reasons. We need to apply a range of qualitative criteria to ensure that we are selecting mechanisms that not only provide a reasonable contribution to project cost, but are accessible, bankable and consistent with government policy and other stakeholder objectives. Finally, there's a question of how the future revenues are brought forward into a pot of money available to apply to the project on day one. It is financing that brings the benefit forward of future funding to support spending obligations. This part of the equation is crucially important and governments have a number of options, including private finance. And there are a few considerations to bear in mind. Firstly, it's important to remember that conventional government funds, i.e. the budget, will often have a role. Innovative funding streams will often only contribute a portion of the funding required for a project, with a considerable subsidy provided by government in the normal way. Secondly, part of the equation might be alternative forms of public investment, such as contributions from different tiers of government. The sizing and incidence of these contributions may be structured to coincide with the receipt of alternative value-based revenue streams, potentially with reference to the value created to the contributing party. And thirdly, for certain projects, the alternative revenue stream, rather than being brought forward to support an upfront construction payment, could be used to support longer-term payment arrangements such as PPPs. So where have alternative models contributed to successful project delivery? And I'm mindful that we've had a number of examples presented to us earlier today, but just to touch on a few, Crossrail. I think it remains the yardstick for a mega project delivered using varied and innovative funding mechanisms. Less than half of the £15 billion funding package is in the form of government grants. Contributions have included a new premium on business rates in London, a grant from Network Rail, developer contributions and beneficiary contributions from organisations such as BAA. I think the ability of the London and UK governments to build the case for Crossrail and its alternative funding is an important lesson for us here in Australia. After a period of initial community consultation in 2002, TfL and the UK Department for Transport developed and published a series of proposals and business cases in support of the Crossrail project. Detailed studies of the expected impacts on the London property market were also published. Together, these studies clearly demonstrated the benefits of the project. Furthermore, the anticipated benefits were communicated through a significant marketing exercise, including numerous public exhibitions. This maximised the chances of the community understanding its impacts and value. Coming more locally, the Gold Coast Rapid Transit project is unique in Australia in that it is jointly funded by all three levels of government. Gold Coast City Council contributed around $120 million to the approximately $1 billion project. Part of the Council's funding contribution will be sourced from the City Transport Improvement Charge, which is currently levied at a rate of $111 per property and is used to fund a range of initiatives to expand the city's transport infrastructure and enhance its ability to meet the city's growing public transport needs. The charge can be considered as a broad but area-based value-based funding mechanism that, along with the charging of user fares, improves the alignment of project funding contributions with the tangible benefits that the community receives as a result of investments in the city's transport system. A unique feature of this approach compared to some models applied overseas is the use of a flat rate levy instead of levies that vary with the value of the property and/or the expected benefit that properties in different locations will receive. This means there will be some beneficiaries who receive a benefit that is higher than their funding contributions. There's also been some challenges in this area, and the Revitalising Central Dandenong project was a major Victorian government urban renewal initiative that commenced in September 2005. It is an example of the challenges that might be faced in the implementation of alternative funding models. The government intended to recoup approximately $140 million of its investment through land sales and the levying of a new infrastructure recovery charge imposed by way of new legislation. This charge is a 5% levy on the total development cost of a project in the declared project area. Unfortunately, during the early stages of creating the Central Dandenong market, the 5% charge was a difficult impost for landowners and developers to absorb, and the purpose, application and calculation of it was poorly understood by the market at the time of introduction. Even the name of the infrastructure recovery charge caused challenges at times. Some developers and landowners thought it was optional and that they could undertake these works themselves and be absolved from the charge. So this just highlights the challenge of the communications task, which I think is something that I mentioned earlier that the Crossrail people in London did very well. In the US, the TIFIA program is a good example of the financing side of the equation. It provides federal credit assistance in the form of direct loans, loan guarantees and standby lines of credit to finance surface transportation projects of national and regional significance. TIFIA loans must be repayable in whole or in part from tolls, user charges or other dedicated revenue sources such as special assessments and tax increment revenues from land sold and developed. General obligation pledges may be accepted as collateral, but only on a case-by-case basis. The TIFIA program has provided a mechanism by which project proponents have been able to develop beneficiary pays funding strategies for projects and leverage the revenues to raise finance to meet construction cost obligations. Lots of examples of a significant investment being made off the back of incremental revenues in the form of future revenues and other value uplifts. So what are the barriers to greater use of alternative funding and financing models in Australian infrastructure projects? Firstly, the challenge of identifying beneficiaries and measuring value. Isolating value is an extremely challenging task. Increases and decreases in economic activity, land and property values, congestion, local amenity and so on are influenced by a myriad of different factors working in concert. A large number of these factors will have nothing or little to do with a project. In practice, project teams make best use of the data they are able to collect and generate. The public and other stakeholders will look for evidence that any funding identified is based on a transparent and comprehensive bottom-up value-based assessment. Secondly, equity of requiring contributions from broad constituencies. In theory, all beneficiaries should be treated in the same way, with an amount of value captured from each that is directly and consistently proportionate to the total benefit they will receive from all sources as a result of the project. This approach, however, risks overlooking considerations of social justice and affordability. It is possible for funding mechanisms to make allowances for contributions from beneficiaries that are consistent with the capacity to pay. Depending on the mechanism, this may make it appropriate to consider differential application of charges, discounts and concessions. It also means it will be important to consider strategies in totality rather than individual mechanisms in isolation, in order to avoid double dipping and excessive burdens for certain individuals or entities. Lack of coherent and recognised methodology. The path to effective project funding requires developing new or improved sources of information and capabilities within and external to government. Being able to map the flow of benefits across stakeholders at a granular level of detail would provide a foundation for considering which funding mechanisms are relevant for a project and the level of funding that could be obtained in order to share the benefits at an appropriate level. And finally, who takes the risk on future value creation? And when it comes to the financing strategy for the funding package, the objective is to have as much confidence as possible in the future revenue streams as to minimise the risk attached to them and hence the cost of finance. So what might success look like? In my mind, it would be enhancing existing infrastructure investment processes to accommodate funding considerations at each stage of the project lifecycle. For example, as projects are conceived, a preliminary scan of value capture potential can reveal whether there is merit in undertaking more detailed analysis at subsequent stages. As projects are developed and alternative funding considerations become a key element of a project, robust processes can ensure that changes in project scope and funding arrangements do not undermine other government policy objectives and value for money considerations. On this slide, I've briefly outlined a process for how we might get to this, starting with some high-level direction from government and ending with embedding alternative ways of thinking into the business as usual of project delivery. So finally, to sum up, some key messages. Firstly, alternative funding models can create demonstrable and transparent connections between value creation and project funding. Our international speakers are demonstrating examples where alternative forms of revenue can support new sources of finance to deliver an accelerated infrastructure pipeline. But we need governments to develop new tools and capabilities. And finally, we have a very mature policy framework in Australia around project development processes. Strengthening them to embed the upfront investigation of funding options would maximise the chances of success. Thank you very much.